Good morning.
Morning.
How are you, Keith?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Okay. It says we're recording.
Yeah, I don't know.
There's Ken.
Yeah, there he is.
Okay, well, as you know, we are going to start on the book of Obadiah. And I'm sure you're all just shaking your head saying, not another sermon on Obadiah. I mean, that's one of the books that just seems like we don't get enough of. So um, we'll try to drag this out into 2 weeks worth of things, but I think that the timing and the message of Obadiah is very appropriate to the time that we're dealing with, and so we'll get into it here. Typically just give you a lot of my sources. A lot of times they don't change, except it's usually a different book by Chuck Mishler each time. This time it's called Prophets to the Gentiles. There were three minor prophets that gave prophecies to the Gentiles, and this is not only the first one we're studying, but as we're about to learn, is probably the first prophecy that actually occurred in time. As far as authorship, I don't think there's any disputing that it was authored by Obadiah. Everybody agrees that it was written by Obadiah. But now this, like last book that we studied was Amos. We had the discussion that this was the book of Amos was the only time Amos was mentioned in the Bible. Obadiah is the other extreme. There was actually at least 13 Obadiahs listed in the Bible throughout time. Some of them were mentioned in the earlier years. There were three mentioned during the time of Saul, David, and Solomon, which would have been about 1000 BC. So pretty much likely that's not the same Obadiah. There are a couple of later references that appear during the reconstruction efforts during the time of King Josiah, and also when the captives returned from Babylon. And this Obadiah was known to also have been an acquaintance of Elijah. There are some people out there that argue that this could have been the same Obadiah, but we'll talk about the timeline a little bit more. The other one that kind of fits the message and the mold a little bit better, in 1 Kings chapter 18, there was an Obadiah that was the governor of Ahab's palace. Now, Ahab was one of the kings shortly after Solomon in the northern kingdom for the Israelites. He was married to Jezebel, and at the time, Jezebel was persecuting prophets all around. This Obadiah was mentioned as a person who took 100 of the prophets and hid them in a cave and protected them from Jezebel. And rabbinical text in several places in the Jewish texts specifically say that this is the same Obadiah, one and the same, that delivered the prophecy. So again, that's just some of the information that you can glean when you get into that research. So from a timeline standpoint, Obadiah is the fourth of the 12 minor prophets, but as we've talked before, where they appear in the book doesn't necessarily mean that's chronological. Some other hints is that this is the shortest book of the Bible. It's only 21 verses in all. It almost reeks a little bit of poetry more than a book. But the shortness of this could be that this was the first one possibly written, and it's not like they had a framework or something that they could cut and paste off the internet and figure out how to write these books. So that potentially could explain why this one was somewhat short as well. As far as the dating of this book, the book itself doesn't give us a lot of hints. If you remember, some of the books specifically mention kings that were in place at the time or different things. Some people have tried to take some of the events that this one describes. Not so sure that that helps on this one as well either. But out of all of the different proposals or suggestions that people have put out there, the two that appear the most frequently is one of them believes that it was around 845 BC, and if you compare that with all the other books that we've talked about, that would have been during the reign of King Jehoram, and that would have made Obadiah the first prophet to actually prophesy or even write down his prophetic message. There are some people that believe that it was after the final destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 587 BC. The thing that we'll get to that in a minute, but so if you go back and look a little bit at just the history of Edom, Edom had rebelled against Jehoram in 848 BC. So that kind of ties in with the first option. And then Edom later allied with Judah against Babylon in 594 BC. But then when that wasn't successful and the Babylon empire overran Judah and everything, well, then Edom kind of turned their back on Israel and started taunting them as well too in 586 BC. So I would argue that if someone was writing down a prophecy or sharing a prophecy at the time the events were going on, well, that's not much of a prophecy. That's just reporting in real time, and that would be like one of us coming out right now and having a prophecy about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's not a prophecy. Now, if we had said that 5 years ago, like Mitt Romney did, and he was made fun of, well, then that would have been more of a prophecy. So I'm a leaner toward Obadiah was giving his message early on in the time, and so I go more for the 845 BC, just based off of that and some of the other hints and different things that we hear from time to time.
I got a question, Ken.
So, yes, sir.
This is kind of off the wall, but it's just something that came to me. We're trying to identify which Obadiah we're talking about and other characters, of course, in the Bible. Here's the silly part of this question. Why didn't they have last names so that we could discern who was who, like we do today?
Yeah, that I'm not sure, and I'd have to do some research to actually find out when last names kind of came up. But from what I do recall from some of my world history, at some point, people's last names kind of became the clan or the village or wherever that they were from. So David may have come from the Elliott clan or the town of Elliott or something like that, and that's how they first, I guess, started discerning last names. And maybe back then when the Bible was written, the footprint of humankind and everything was such that they didn't feel like they needed to do that. But if you just look at the kings at the time, we talked about that before, that some of these names get used over and over and over. And there was two Jehorams kings at the same time. There were two Jehoashes or Jehoash and different things. So I don't know, but it would have been nice if they all would have had last names or social security numbers and stuff so we could tell who's who. But one of the things that I was going to say is what do I usually tell you? whenever we have questions like this and that kind of stuff, I was getting ready to say, he could have been named Bob or John. And the truth of the matter is that's probably not that important. We get caught in the minutia sometimes, but the focus should be on the message and everything, as much as the deliverer and different things. So we use quotes all the time, but we don't always remember who they came from and everything. But so many of them come from the Bible. So again, don't know if I can answer your question with any more detail than that, David.
One of the things that I'm reading is that it originated in the 11th century, and China was one of the earliest civilizations to use surnames. And they did that. They were passed down by mothers. And that's all I've got.
Huh. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that when you talk to most people from China or Korea or the Far East and things like that, they lead with their last name instead of their first name and stuff. So if you hear somebody's name, usually what you think is their first name is actually their last name or their surname, so to speak. So one thing's for certain is we're not, definitely not all the same and didn't all come from the same culture. That's for sure. Well, looking at our list of kings, if indeed 845 BC is the time of Amos, then that would put him right in this area here where a lot of the turmoil was going on. If you remember, this was the time when the two kingdoms were trying to get along and merge a little bit, and but at the same time, this was also where a lot of the power struggles and everything were going on as well. We talked earlier about Athaliah and greatest grandmother ever and different things. So again, that's some good info, but whether we're 100% correct or not is kind of beside the point. The timeline of the prophets, as we've seen, a lot of the early minor prophets was primarily during the Kings and Chronicles era. Then the larger prophets who wrote the bigger books and shared more information were kind of at the tail end of Kings and Chronicles and even overlapped with Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther. Narrowing that down a little bit, again, these lines are representative of about 10 years. So Obadiah was more than likely about the same time as Joel, but he was before Joel. So the interesting thing about that is, if Obadiah was really the first prophet and he was prophesying against Edom and whatever, you kind of wonder if he wasn't carrying the same word of God, kind of like Amos, and let's go ahead and tell the Israelites and the Judeans and everything who the bad people are around them before we hone in on their bad acts. So Obadiah's focus is primarily Edom, even though he does mention Israel and Judah a little bit. It's not in the context of see what they did wrong. It's other things. Obadiah's ministry. The Hebrew name for Obadiah, it means servant of Yahweh or servant of God. Some people now have pointed out that the Hebrew word for servant is also the Hebrew word for slave and things like that as well too. But apparently this was still a pretty popular name at that time, because as we've said, there's been a lot of Obadiahs mentioned. Some of them could have been, going down through lineages of, well, I named you after your grandfather and things like that. But nonetheless, it probably had a more positive meaning than Amos. If you remember, the meaning of Amos was burden and everything. So Obadiah definitely had a little more of a positive message coming out of the gate with his name. According to the Jewish Talmud, Obadiah is said to have been a convert to Judaism from Edom. There was a time when a large portion of Edom was converted to Judaism. And there are some texts and stuff out there that perhaps he was even a descendant of Eliphaz, from our Job study, the wise man from Teman. And also, according to rabbinic tradition, it's been said that Obadiah was chosen to prophesy against Edom because he was himself an Edomite in history. So you recall Amos didn't fare too well because he was a Judean coming to Israel to prophesy against Israel. That didn't go over too well with the locals. But maybe they thought that, or God here thought that letting Obadiah prophesy against his own heritage might have been a little more accepted. There's also some rabbinic traditions and writings that suggest Obadiah was a very rich person, and that but he took all of his wealth and was expending all of his wealth in feeding the poor prophets. And that kind of goes along with the storyline that he hid 100 of them in a cave during the Jezebel era. Sounds like a possibly one of the first servant leadership type people, where he knew where his riches came from. He knew where his glory and all that he achieved was owed to God, and so he used it to continue his message. And the rabbinic tradition takes it as far as to say he probably even went broke, and he had to borrow money and pay interest on it. He borrowed it from the King Jehoram so that he could continue this process of feeding the poor prophets and everything. So the message there is very similar to a lot of the messages that we studied when we were doing the gospel of Luke and everything, that Mary and several of the women actually came from rich homes and everything, and used their purse and everything to help the disciples. This really sounds a lot like that. And in case this ever comes up in a Bible trivia pursuit game, Obadiah is said to be buried in Sebastia, which is a area of Philistia. And it's also the same site where Elisha is buried. And it's also been said that that's where the body of John the Baptist is believed to be buried as well too. So he's thought well of at that time, and was said to have been in good company. Now the message and purpose of Obadiah, we've touched on it a couple times, is that if his prophecy again was delivered in 845 BC, it again makes him the first of the recorded prophets. And he came out and prophesied against a Gentile nation of Edom. We're going to go into, we touched a little bit on Edom and the history of Edom. We're going to spend a little more time on it this time, but very little is mentioned about the acts and the judgments of Israel, other than the actions that were made against Israel or to Israel. And then there's also some sections in Obadiah that talks about their future restoration and the triumph that they will experience at some point. But the focal point of the message is more upon how Edom, whose progenitor or person that created or started Edom was Esau. The focus is more upon how Edom acts toward Israel and Judah, which was founded by Esau's brother Jacob. God's judgment was predicted for Edom because of her arrogance and trusting in her geographical security, her diplomatic treaties that she made with other nations, and the fact that Edom trusted in her wise men rather than the true God of Israel. Kings at that time, or leaders, tended to go to their council and everything rather than prayer. And my, don't we see that a lot today? And if some of our leaders would just go back to prayer, maybe the world would be a lot better off than it is at this place in time. But primarily and mainly, Edom was punished for her pride and for her treatment of and lack of compassion for what is known to be her brother nation. So setting the scene, with Amos, we did, Amos he did talk about Edom a little bit, albeit it was probably after Obadiah, but Amos talked a lot about several of the Gentile nations, and he talked about their sins. But at the time of Amos, and that's the problem with studying these out of order. But Amos touched on the slave trading that was going on in Edom. Edom was capturing Israelites and selling them on the open market, but primarily at the time, Amos was also talking about the fact that the way Edom and the Edomites were unforgiving and hateful toward Israel. And so when we were talking about Amos, we touched briefly on the disputes between Esau and Jacob, but the story is going to go a lot deeper than that. So we'll dive into that a little bit, because I did have one question that it's not really going to be a pop-up question. I think everybody will be able to tackle it relatively easily, but I didn't give it to you in advance. But Genesis 25 is where the tale of the birth of the twins started. If you remember, when Isaac and Rebekah first got pregnant, they were told by God that there are two nations in your womb, and that being the twins, Esau and Jacob. And I think it's obvious to point out that they were maternal twins. They were not maternal in that they weren't identical. Esau came out first, and that he was red and hairy. And some of you wonder if he's more Irish than Jewish or whatever, but he kind of became Isaac's favorite in that, Esau was the man's man. He was burly and bulky and made for the outdoors. He enjoyed hunting and chasing game and providing food for the family and everything, where Jacob was more of a mama's boy. He was more of a mild man. He stayed in the tents, and as you'll find out in a little bit, he liked to cook and different things. And so as a result of that, he was at home with mom while Esau was out in the wild and stuff. So he became Rebekah's favorite, and which is not hard to understand and agree with. But as we talked about, the battle started in the womb. It seems like they were trying to get set for their position in life even before they were born. And there was at one point after they were born that Esau came in from the wild, and he was extremely hungry, hadn't eaten for a long time, and felt like he was ready to die. And he asked Jacob for some soup and bread, and Jacob decided to take advantage of Esau's condition and offered to give him some food in exchange for his birthright. And Esau figured, hey, if I don't do this, I'm going to die anyway, so why not? So Esau relented and kind of gave up his birthright in exchange for the soup. And but he despised that fact that he had given that up from that day forward. And this is the part of the Bible in the sections of Genesis that trouble me, is that if Esau had truly given up his birthright to Jacob at this point, well, then why did the later betrayal have to happen? And I don't know if I've ever heard or found a good answer of that. But the second act of betrayal by Jacob and Rebekah came when Isaac was on his deathbed. He had poor eyesight. He really couldn't tell who was who. But he did have other senses that he would rely on from time to time. And so after a brief conversation with Esau, he basically told Esau, you know, I don't know when my last days are going to be, but I would love to have some of your wild game or some venison to eat before I go. And so he sends Esau out to hunt for some game and to make a meal. And while Esau is gone, Jacob and Rebekah hatch up a scheme or a plot to trick Isaac into giving Jacob Esau's blessing. And again, if Esau had already given it to him, I'm not sure why they felt the need, other than I guess this was his backup plan, so to speak. But they knew that Isaac would be able to tell Jacob from Esau, just because of the feel of the hair on his hands and the back of his neck and the smell and everything. So they took a goat skin and placed it on Jacob so that he would feel and smell like Esau. And they sent him to Isaac and pretended to be Esau. And so Isaac then gave Jacob the eldest son blessing instead of to Esau. And you know, at that time, Esau discovered this betrayal, and he went to his dad and said, you know, can't you take it back? And Isaac said, you know, son, I only have one blessing and I've already given it to your brother. So he said, you know, I can't take it back. And since it couldn't be reversed, Esau's hate for his brother and for his brother's actions, you know, got even worse. And now it was to the point that Esau was ready to kill Jacob. And so to escape the death, Rebekah tells Jacob, says, you know, you need to flee. And so he goes to Rebekah's brother's house, his uncle Laban. And while he's there, you know, he's instructed to get a wife, and also she should be a non-Canaanite wife, because Isaac did not want his sons to marry Canaanite women. And not sure if that's because that's part of the prophecy that God put on Isaac and his lineage. But Esau also left the area and went to a different region. And there he took 2 Canaanite wives, pretty much just to spite his father. He knew his father didn't want him to take Canaanite wives, but that's what he did. And so, you know, this is where the point where you say yada, 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 bada boom, bada bing. At some point, the brothers do come back together. Jacob is still very weary that Esau might still be wanting to kill him. So, but at this point, both brothers had done very well. They both had amassed large numbers of animals and everything. And so Jacob was going to send a big portion or a gift to Esau, kind of as a way to try to get over the disagreement. But because he doesn't completely trust him, he's going to send half of them first and says, we'll see what happens. And then if all goes well, then we'll send the rest, and then I'll meet up with him. And again, the brothers kind of, they met, they kind of made up. Esau did not accept the gift. He told Jacob to he could keep his treasures and everything, that he didn't need it, and that he should use that to continue taking care of his clan and his family and so on. And but so in summary, the 2 brothers do go off, and they become the father of 2 different nations, just as God had predicted. And Jacob becomes the father of Israel, and Esau becomes the progenitor of really not only the Edomites, but also the Kenizzites and the Amalekites, and helps grow those 2 nations along. And but we know through time, though, that the feuds, while you knew they buried the hatchet here at this one moment where they hugged it out, there was still not complete agreement on everything. And Esau's death has been recorded that when Jacob was buried, he was to be buried into a specific cave, and but Esau claimed to own title to that cave and wasn't going to let Jacob be buried there. And now here's the funny thing. Apparently the courthouse was in Egypt. So they said the document that would have recorded the transfer of this cave from Esau to Jacob was in Egypt. So they sent some people off to go to Egypt to find this deed or whatever, or at least this transaction. And while they were gone, Esau's grandson was furious and said, you know, what am I to do? Am I supposed to let my grandfather just lie there rotting more or less while we wait for this document to come back? So he takes a big weapon and hits Esau with it, cuts off his head and everything. And so Jacob and Esau's head were both buried in that same cave. And so like we said, even though it seems like these two nations moved on at one time, Edom still refused to let the Israelites pass through Edom when they were making their exodus from Egypt to the Holy Land. They had to go around Edom. Edom then also throughout time has always taken a position against Israel. We talked already about the slavery and so on. But there were times when they actually would join up with the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they would attack Israel. So they kind of became a nation that would go in the direction of the wind. And as long as they felt like there were strong factions against Israel, they would join up with them. But if they felt like those factions were maybe weaker or wasn't in their best interest, they would go the other way. So, but the summary is that, you know, these disputes at the end of the day was all about the land and the birthrights. And the biggest thing came down to the pride of Esau and Edom. And, you know, part of me feels for Esau. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we're all human beings. And when we get wronged by somebody, we tend to hold a grudge for quite some time. You know, even though we're taught as Christians to just let it go, it can be difficult sometimes. And I think that was the pride that Esau felt, that, you know, he was probably the hardest worker. He was his dad's favorite and everything else. And he felt like he had been wronged, and he just wasn't ready to give it to God and let it go. So this conflict, you know, raged on for a really, really long time. And it has even, you know, evolved into a lot of the skirmishes and the things that we see going on in the Middle East right now as well. So at the last minute last night, I came up with a question, and I said, you know, understanding God made a sovereign choice to bring about a chosen nation through Jacob. I mean, even though he said there's going to be two nations in your womb, he had even back then had identified that Jacob was going to be the birth of the Israelite nation and different things. And so part of me says, okay, well, okay, God, you made that decision, but why did you put this family and everybody else through such turmoil and that kind of stuff? So my first question is, you know, how could God have done that differently, or what? You know, you go back in time and say, okay, if this would have happened, then it would have had a completely different butterfly effect. What could God have done differently that would have completely got rid of all this drama?
He could have let Esau continue to get his birthright, have his birthright.
Yeah, he could have. That would have defeated the prophecy, though, that Jacob was going to lead the nation.
That's true.
Go back in time a little further.
Yeah.
Go back in time a little further. What could God have done? He could have let Jacob be born first.
That's true. Yeah.
That was the simplest thing. And you look back and you hear the stories that Jacob grabbed Esau by the heel and everything else. And you say, here's Jacob is in the womb saying, whoa, I'm supposed to go first. And had he simply done that, Jacob would have got the birthright. Esau would have completely understood and wouldn't have felt cheated or anything else. So, God has a funny way of doing things sometimes. And so then that kind of brought about my next question. Okay, so what are we able to glean from this? Or what does this teach us about that story that God didn't let Jacob be born first?
Well, it's very helpful to me to look back at these Old Testament guys and realize they were not perfect. They were far from perfect, but yet they were main characters in God's ongoing story. It's a little disturbing that Jacob was such a sleazeball, to dress up like a goat, but it is encouraging that God can use us no matter what our flaws are.
Right. Yeah. I think of it as this was a teaching moment or whatever. This was God's way of hopefully teaching people how they should act or shouldn't act and that kind of stuff when things don't go their way. And a lot of these things in the Bible were probably written more for us than they were for everybody else back then. And so, yeah. And, I look back a little bit as well, too, and wonder if it's not stories like this and everything that kind of makes it easy to stereotype Israel and the Jewish people and things like that, these stories of conniving and cheating and stuff like that throughout the Bible kind of puts a mindset in people's minds sometime. So, but thank you for that, Linda. And yeah, you're right. It's hard to root for somebody that felt like he had to lie, cheat his way, steal to where he needed to get to.
Well, and another thing that I think we can glean from this story is that one of our big questions is always, why does God let bad things happen to good people? And the fact that he set up this enmity between the two brothers and foretold many, many years ago that this strife between the Edomites and the Israelites would still be going on today, shows that we don't like to think about God causing bad things to happen, but he does. It's very clear from our study of the Old Testament that he brings the good times and the bad times. So that kind of addresses that issue that we struggle with.
Yep. Yeah, we don't always understand it, but we know it's there, and we just have to learn how to find our own way to live with those kind of things when they happen in real time to us as well too. So good point.
I think makes me think about when you ask why about a lot of things, we could simply reply, God only knows.
Right. Yep, very true. And sometimes we don't know how much things are from God's hand or Satan's or somebody else's, but like we've always said in all of our studies, that even the evil things that are brought about by evil people and God, I mean, God allows those things to happen when he could prevent them. But he's got a meaning and a message and a purpose that will come out of pretty much all of those. So,
Right.
Yep, I agree, everybody.
That's one of the things I always think.
So
Does God allow it, or does God cause it? I've always thought that God allowed things to happen rather than causing them.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example and stuff. And but the people on earth, they don't know. And it's just like when Job was going through what he was going, Job completely 100% believed that God was causing it, when we know, because we read chapters 1 and 2, that God was simply allowing it to happen. And we have the benefit of thousands of years of writing and scriptures and everything that they didn't have back then. So history teaches us a lot. And you're right, David. And it's because we don't want to believe that a good God causes bad things to happen. I think is a lot of it as well.
I think that's true.
But
If
again,
God allows it, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, you go, Keith.
If God allows it to happen, is he not ultimately responsible for it?
Yeah.
I think it has to go with his plan for whatever he's decided.
Right.
Yeah, and sometimes sometimes the outcome is a part of God's plan. And like we've said before, is, you know, when people pass, you know, sometimes there's a better, there's going to be another outcome from that, or there's God had other plans for that person or whatever. So I think we can see that frequently and everything. So
Yeah.
we just have to understand what we can and continue to believe that it's all God's will, no matter who, what, when, where, how, and why. So
Yeah.
well, let's see if we can get into a few of the scriptures or whatever here. The book of Obadiah. Here's another little clue or a hint, maybe as to the placement of timing of Obadiah. The book of Obadiah is almost identical to portions of Jeremiah chapter 49. And if our timeline is correct, Jeremiah actually wrote his prophecy and everything 30 years later. And there were some actual events and things like that have been tied down and occurred. I think there's even the mention of some kings that were in place at the time of Jeremiah. And so one could again use this information to argue that Obadiah was written at the same time as Jeremiah, or that Obadiah's was written first and Jeremiah had a copy of Obadiah's writings and prophecy and used it to write his. And so again, which one's right or wrong doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter to me if it was in 848 BC or 586 BC. The message today still applies no matter what. Verse 1 starts out and it clearly explains that these verses to come are the words of God as experienced by Obadiah in a vision. The vision states that God has made a call to many nations to rise up and go against Edom in battle. And as a result, Edom will be made small and looked on with great contempt. So I think what's interesting here is God starts out with, you're about to be punished. He hasn't told him why yet. I mean, the why comes a little bit later. But as he said, as a result, Edom will be made small and looked on with great contempt. I think some Bibles use the word despise. When someone actually, you think of this in a way like a bully in a schoolyard or whatever. It's the smaller, weaker kids and everything that get looked down upon and everything. That's, even though Edom used to be one of the bullies, they're about to have a role reversal going on here, and they are about to become the little kid and picked on. Now verse 3 then start getting into what Edom's sin was. Verse 3 points out that the great sin in the Edom is their pride, and that their pride has deceived them. And verse 3 also makes reference to their geophysical location. Says, the pride of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, you who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Now, most people will read that clefts in the rock and say, okay, great. They lived in a rocky area. They were lived up high. I want to show you what they're actually making reference to. This is in the middle of Jordan, which is used to be Edom and things, but there was a narrow valleys cut into some of the rocks that led to a larger open area where the city or the Teman and some of these people lived. These actually were great from a military standpoint because that was the only way in or the only way out. They couldn't rappel down the cliffs. I mean, I guess they could, but they typically would only come in through these narrow passages in the rock. And so even if they were attacked by a military, this provided a very big, I guess, geophysical buttress or whatever to fight that off. And this is the same area, although we've all seen this place here. It's Petra. It was in everything we know about the Bible. We always learn from Raiders of the Lost Ark or one of the other Harrison Ford movies. But just want to be clear, the Edomites did not create this structure here, but I wanted you to see the valley or the place in which they lived. This is what the Bible's talking about, the clefts of the rock and things and their military might. So as we said, the narrow valleys made it extremely difficult for a large war party to attack them because the only way in, they more or less had to be in single file. Well, if you just put all your archers and everything else at the somewhere in that passage, somebody coming at you in single file, you just got to sit there and pick them off one at a time. So Edom felt like because they dwelt in this rocky valley with only a few ways in, that they felt like their fortress was impenetrable. And for a mortal man, that was probably true. But what God is saying here is I'm going to tap several nations on the shoulder and send them after you, and with my support, you won't have the same defenses that you would have against mortal man. I wanted to point out that the Nabateans were actually the people that carved those temples and things into the rocks. And you can't really just pick out a year because an effort like that took hundreds of years and stuff. So the range of that could have been anywhere from 300 BC to some say as late as 200 AD before it was all finished. But the Nabateans kind of forced out the Edomites, who even got their name changed to Idumea at one point as well too. But this was kind of some of the slow the slow death, I guess, of Edom, so to speak. But God, again, is using metaphors here of the eagle. He's saying, I don't care if you're an eagle at the highest nest and flying high to the stars and everything. I'm still higher than you, and I'm going to be able to bring you down. So while mortal man might not be able to pass judgment on you, I certainly can. And verses 5 and verse 5 then uses a couple of examples to kind of explain the level of devastation and destruction that they're going to experience. And the first one, he says, even if a thief comes in the middle of the night and it robs you, Basically the thief is going to take what he can carry. He's going to take the valuable stuff and leave the rest. He's going to leave some things behind. And the same token, he says, the same applies with a positive thing, like the gathering of grapes. Even though the majority of the crop is taken away, there are always some of the grapes that are left behind, whether they are unripe, too ripe, they're on the ground, or they're hidden behind leaves and that kind of stuff. So what God is saying is, if a robber or a grape gatherer came in, they're still going to leave some stuff for you. But God's saying, when I get there, I'm taking everything. You're not going to experience anything left behind. You're going to have complete and total devastation. It's going to be kind of like when the locusts come through or whatever, or when a flood or a tidal wave comes through. You're not going to have anything left. So it's going to be complete devastation. And he also points out that, when God judges Edom, they're going to know the sting of their treachery against them. Even though they've created these alliances with other nations and formed treaties, those are going to be torn up very quickly. And then those people are going to double cross them, people that they thought would help. And we saw that with some of the other studies too, that people that they tried to rely on actually became their attackers and so on. So the Edomites are not going to, as soon as God starts working on them, they're not going to have any friends. And then the verse also goes on to talk a little bit about the Edomites were renowned for their great wisdom and their military might. It says even destroy the wise men from Edom and understand from the mountains of Esau, then your mighty men, O Teman, shall be dismayed. The wise men, when we studied Job, Eliphaz was kind of treated like, or thought to be, a wise man from Teman. So that area was known to have, some intelligence. And of course, their military was thought to be strong because nobody could defeat them because of where they were located and so on. But God is saying that he's going to bring such a great judgment that their wise men and counselors and their mighty men and warriors are also going to be destroyed. So with that, I'm going to end with verse 9. Next week, we will try to cover all of verses 10 through 21. Read your study guides 3 and 4, see if we gain anything from there. But these verses are going to shed more light on the sins of Edom, their treatment of Israel, and what the final triumph of Israel is going to look like. So, any comments, questions, thoughts from anybody?
Edom was also in a very mountainous